name was Raed, one of the original pro-democracy activists in Syria.
الناشط الإعلامي رائد الفارس مع صديقه وزميله المرض. Two activists shot dead by gunmen in Idlib.
يعتبر رائد الفارس هو مهندس الإحراق.
He warned that without voices like Radio Fresh, another generation would take up arms.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories that we're covering this week. In Syria, journalism and activism both take a hit with the murder of someone who did both, Raed Fares. Former collaborators no longer on the best of terms. The Guardian and Julian Assange are going at it once again. Bordering on propaganda, the TV shows that are monetizing migrants and smugglers. And what would Jesus do if he was an evangelical American? Biblical talking points, updated for 2018.
One soul for the whole world, that is an amazing deal.
7 years into the war in Syria, with all the state and non-state actors who have become part of that story, it's easy to forget how it all began. With an uprising, a people's rebellion against an authoritarian government, a fight for democracy and a free media. Raed Fares was one of the figureheads of that movement until he was shot dead last week alongside his cameraman, probably by fighters linked to Al-Qaeda. Fares used various forms of media, especially radio, to push a revolutionary agenda from the town of Kafran Bel in the rebel-held province of Idlib. 5 years ago, he started organizing protests there and came up with innovative ways to call out the hypocrisy of the West. He riffed on news coverage he disapproved of. He focused on the suffering of ordinary Syrians. With Assad and his backers still largely in control, some see the killing of Fares as symbolic, the extinguishing of any remaining hope that the values of the Arab Spring can live on in Syria. Our starting point this week is the town where Raed Fares lived and died, the one he put on the map, Kafran Bel.
Raed was a one-man revolution. He did it all, but he specialized in the media. He excelled there. He was a pioneer. He may not have been a professional journalist, but he did what you could call alternative media. He is impossible to replace.
Raed Fares' story reflects the path of the Syrian uprising. Firstly, this massive protest movement challenging an authoritarian, despotic Assad regime. And Raed Fares represented the dynamic of this protest movement.
The first wave of protest leaders were either dead, they had disappeared in jail somewhere, or they had fled the country to seek safety in exile. But Raed Fares was one of the few who remained in his country and who continued his work from inside Syria. And he paid with his life for that activism.
In most places, straddling the line between journalism and activism is problematic. Objectivity can suffer. Audiences don't really know what they're getting. And calling the late Raed Fares a journalist would be inaccurate. There was too much activism in the work he did. However, that's an ethical issue for outsiders to ponder. Inside Syria, more than 7 years into this war, such a debate would feel like a luxury, an indulgence.
One of the most important aspects of media work and the Syrian revolution is this blurring of boundaries between journalism, activism, art making, and human rights work. When you are in a very dark, difficult situation where your survival cannot be taken for granted, you're not as concerned with a sort of a strictly, narrowly defined journalism focused on impartiality, on basic facts, as finding out how to survive and helping other people get information that helps them survive. And Raed, in that sense, was what I called a creative insurgent, right? He was an exemplary creative insurgent.
Well, Raed Fares didn't hide the fact that he was an activist. He didn't hide his views or his political slant. On the contrary, he and his colleagues shared their messages in bright colors on white fabric banners and in biting cartoons and video skits. So, you know, that was very clear where he was coming from. And they also spared no one. Their messages were directed against the Assad regime. They were also directed against the Syrian political opposition in exile, the foreign backers of both the rebels and the Assad government. as well as the Islamists who came to have increasing power in Kaframbil and other parts of Idlib where Raed was based.
Raed Fares started to make his mark in the Syrian media space in 2013, 2 years after the war broke out. At the time, Syrians in search of news were relying on TV channels coming out of Damascus, controlled by the Assad government, and pan-Arab news networks, some of which had their own dogs in the fight. Fares's contribution to a media landscape that was mostly high-tech, the TV news channels beaming in via satellite, the bloggers spreading information and misinformation over the web, was tactically low-tech. The channel he helped create was called Radio Fresh.
Raed Fares and his team established Radio Fresh in 2013. This was a way to promote different democratic ideals, women's role in society, challenging conservative, traditional ideas as well. And it was very important to have an independent media to show the message of the people, what they were struggling for against the regime, but also from the Western or Gulf medias that had their own agenda. So it was very important to have an independent media instrument from the ground.
Radio is very easy to transmit and very easy to listen to. Radio also can give you minute by minute very specific micro-local information that in some cases can be life-saving. So for example, you can learn that Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria has set up a checkpoint and they're looking for activists that they're kidnapping at that crossing. And so activists know not to drive or not to walk that way at that moment. And that's crucially important. So radio is crucial here, and the decision to use radio, I think, was brilliant.
Raed Fares also knew his audiences. His messages to the outside world, pleas for help, were in English, splashed on banners, telegenic, and designed for export via someone else's camera. Radio Fresh broadcasts in Arabic to local listeners. No one has claimed responsibility for Fares's murder, but Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, a fundamentalist group in control of Kafranbel, a former affiliate of Al-Qaeda, is among the suspects. Extremist groups had attacked the station before. They opposed its output and would have disapproved of the way Radio Fresh was funded. The station was launched with the help of U.S. State Department dollars, and the U.S. continued to bankroll it until the Trump administration halted the funding earlier this year.
Accepting foreign support in the form of money, of equipment, of technical expertise is an extremely difficult question. And here's the logic. A small group of people trying to survive extremely violent conflict. On the other side, we have a well-equipped regime that's using planes and barrel bombs and even chemical weapons in some cases. It's supported by Russia and Iran. What can I do if I'm desperate? It becomes very difficult not to accept any aid.
Everybody in Syria was backed by somebody, but that didn't necessarily mean that they bought them, that those patrons had bought them ideologically. And Raed Fares before the US State Department funding was the same as Raed Fares after the US State Department funding. But the US funding etched, if you like, the bullseye that was already in Raed Fares's back, and it made it easier for some of his critics to claim that he was a US stooge or doing the US's bidding.
Before the war began, Raed Fares wasn't even a journalist, nor was he an activist. He worked in real estate while studying to be a doctor. He brought to journalism the zeal of a convert, and his commitment did not wane. Unlike so many Syrian activists who became targets, he did not leave the country to continue his work in exile, although no one would have blamed him if he had. He stayed, knowing that decision could cost him his life. His voice has been silenced, but the station he helped create remains on the air, reporting the news to the people of Kafranbel.
Raed Fares was an ideal. For 7 or 8 years, Raed worked to establish a moral and principled foundation for the revolution and to promote freedom of thought and expression. He is impossible to replace. We will continue his work and carry forward his message, but Free Syria has lost one of her greatest sons, Raed Fares.